The first military dog arrived just after sunrise. The second came 43 minutes later. The third arrived before anyone in the hospital had time to understand what was happening. 3 different military units. 3 different handlers. 3 dogs with 3 completely different behavioral emergencies. The most experienced military veterinarians at Walter Reed tried everything they had learned over decades. But none of the dogs responded. Then a quiet emergency room nurse, who wasn't even assigned to the military K9 unit, stepped into the hallway. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't give commands. She didn't claim to know anything the doctors didn't. Yet before 2 hours had passed, all 3 military dogs had done something no one thought they would. The entire hospital stopped. A senior military veterinarian stared at the young nurse for several long seconds before quietly asking the question everyone in the room was thinking. "Who are you?" Before we begin, if you love heartfelt military K9 stories inspired by real acts of loyalty and courage, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Have you ever met a dog that changed someone's life forever? We'd love to read your story. Wednesday mornings at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center were usually predictable. The emergency department was always busy. Ambulances came and went. Doctors moved quickly through brightly lit hallways. Nurses checked monitors, updated charts, comforted worried families, and prepared for another demanding day. Just across the courtyard, inside the military working dog medical wing, the atmosphere was usually calmer. Most of the patients walked in on 4 legs. Some came for annual health examinations. Some were recovering from retirement. Others were preparing to return to active duty after routine evaluations. The veterinarians there had worked with military dogs for decades. Many of them had deployed alongside Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine reconnaissance units, and Air Force security teams. Very little surprised them anymore until 8:12 that morning. The automatic doors opened. A tall Army sergeant hurried inside, holding the leash of an aging German shepherd. The dog's name tag read, Rangerton, years old, retired Army Special Operations K9. His once dark muzzle had faded to silver around his nose. His posture still reflected years of disciplined military service. But something wasn't right. The moment Ranger entered the unfamiliar hallway, he stopped walking, his ears flattened. His breathing became shallow. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He simply refused to move another step. The sergeant knelt beside him. "Easy, partner. We're okay." Ranger never looked at him. His eyes moved across every doorway, every ceiling light, every unfamiliar face, almost as though he were searching for danger that wasn't there. Dr. Jonathan Hayes stepped forward. For nearly 4 decades, he had served as one of the military's leading veterinary behavior specialists, gray-haired, calm pawn. Nothing about his voice ever sounded rushed. He crouched several feet away. "Good morning, Ranger." No response. Another veterinarian slowly approached from the side. Ranger quietly backed away, not aggressively, just enough to keep everyone at a distance. Dr. Hayes raised a hand. Everyone stop. The room became still. He looked toward the sergeant. "When did this begin?" The soldier sighed. "About 3 weeks ago. He was fine after retirement. Then one morning, The sergeant struggled to find the words. He stopped sleeping. He startles at every unfamiliar sound. He refuses to enter new buildings. He won't even walk into my own parents' house." Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "No physical illness? We've checked everything. Multiple times." The older veterinarian gently folded his arms. "Then today isn't about medicine. It's about trust." The sergeant looked defeated. I've tried everything. I don't know how to help him anymore. There was something in his voice that caught everyone's attention. Not frustration, not embarrassment. Guilt. As though he believed he had somehow failed the partner who had spent years protecting him. At 8:29 a.m., another pair of footsteps echoed through the hallway. A nurse entered carrying a stack of patient files. Her name was Claire Donovan, 34 years old. Emergency department trauma nurse. Chestnut brown, hair tied neatly into a low ponytail. Warm hazel eyes, navy blue scrubs, white hospital identification badge, black stethoscope resting around her neck. She wasn't scheduled to work in the veterinary unit. She had simply been asked to deliver paperwork, while another nurse covered the emergency department. She noticed the silence immediately. Doctors weren't speaking. Technicians weren't moving. Even the phones seemed unusually quiet. Claire looked toward Ranger, then toward the exhausted sergeant, kneeling beside him. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she quietly asked one of the technicians, "How long has he been standing there?" "Nearly 20 minutes. He won't move." Claire nodded. She didn't offer advice. She simply watched. Military dogs fascinated her, not because they were extraordinary animals, but because they reminded her of people she'd spent years caring for in the trauma unit. Some injuries couldn't be seen. Sometimes the hardest patients weren't the ones in pain. They were the ones carrying too much of it in silence. She noticed something no one else seemed to be paying attention to. Every few seconds, Ranger glanced toward the sergeant, not because he wanted instructions, because he was checking on him, again, and again, and again. Claire quietly asked, "Has he been doing that all morning?" The sergeant looked confused. "Doing what?" "Looking at you." The soldier nodded. "He never stops. If I leave the room, he panics. If I sit down, he watches me breathe." Dr. Hayes looked thoughtfully at the dog, then back at Claire. She continued softly, "He isn't watching the room. He's watching you." The hallway became quiet. The sergeant frowned. "I don't understand." Claire hesitated. "I might be wrong, but—" She looked back at Ranger. "It doesn't look like he's afraid for himself. It looks like he's afraid something will happen to you." Nobody spoke. The sergeant slowly lowered his eyes. There was something he hadn't told anyone. Dr. Hayes noticed immediately. "Sergeant, what aren't you saying?" The young soldier looked away. For nearly 10 seconds, no one spoke. Finally, he quietly admitted, "I haven't been sleeping." The room stayed silent. He continued, "After we retired, I started having panic attacks. I thought I hid it from him." A sad smile crossed his face. "I guess I didn't." Dr. Hayes looked back toward Ranger. Suddenly, the old German shepherd's behavior made perfect sense. He wasn't refusing the hospital because he distrusted doctors. He believed his partner needed protection. And military working dogs never abandoned a mission until they believed it was complete. Claire quietly walked toward a nearby chair. Instead of approaching Ranger, she sat beside the sergeant, not beside the dog. Beside the man, the room watched curiously. She smiled gently. "You've spent years taking care of him." The sergeant nodded. "Now let him see that someone is taking care of you." The young soldier looked confused. Claire turned toward Dr. Hayes. "Would you mind checking him first?" The veterinarian blinked. "You mean the sergeant?" Dr. Hayes immediately understood. He approached slowly. Not the dog, the handler, as the doctor quietly checked the soldier's blood pressure and asked simple questions. Ranger never moved. He watched every second. Claire didn't look at the dog. She didn't call his name. She simply stayed seated beside the sergeant, talking calmly about ordinary things. How long he'd been retired. whether he planned to stay in the army, whether Ranger still liked chasing tennis balls. The conversation slowly became less about medicine and more about life after service. Several minutes passed, then something happened. Ranger walked forward. Only one step, no one moved. Another step. His breathing slowed. For the first time since arriving, he lowered his head, not in fear. In relief, the sergeant looked at him. "Buddy." Ranger gently rested his head against the soldier's knee. Then, for the first time in weeks, the old German shepherd closed both eyes. The sergeant's voice cracked. "He hasn't done that since my retirement ceremony." Dr. Hayes quietly looked at Claire. "You knew?" She shook her head. "No. I noticed." There was a difference just as Dr. Hayes prepared to speak. The emergency entrance doors opened again. This time, a military police officer hurried inside, followed by a young Navy petty officer. Beside him walked a lean Belgian Malinois, wearing an active-duty tactical harness. The dog's name patch read, "Ghost." Unlike Ranger, Ghost wasn't frightened. His posture was rigid. Every movement was controlled. Every muscle remained tense. The moment anyone stepped toward the petty officer, Ghost silently moved between them. No barking, no growling, just absolute determination. The petty officer looked exhausted. "I'm sorry. He won't let anyone near me." Dr. Hayes slowly looked at Claire, then back toward Ghost. Something told him the extraordinary morning wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. For a brief moment, no one in the military veterinary wing spoke. Ghost stood silently in front of the young Navy petty officer. His amber eyes followed every movement inside the room. Unlike Ranger, Ghost wasn't nervous. He wasn't confused. He was standing exactly where years of military training had taught him to stand, between danger and the person he had sworn to protect. The petty officer gave an embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry. I know this is difficult." Dr. Jonathan Hayes shook his head. "No, this is different." He slowly circled several feet away, carefully observing Ghost. "He's not refusing us. He's evaluating us." The young sailor nodded. "He hasn't left my side in 36 hours. He won't eat unless I eat. He won't sleep unless I sleep. And if anyone reaches toward me..." Ghost quietly shifted sideways, breaking the doctor's path without making a sound. One of the younger veterinarians whispered, "I've never seen him move so precisely." Another replied, "He isn't threatening anyone. He's just making sure no one gets too close." The petty officer looked down. "He wasn't like this before. What changed?" Dr. Hayes asked gently. The young sailor hesitated. For several seconds, he stared at the floor. Finally, he admitted, "I don't know." His answer came too quickly. Dr. Hayes noticed, so did Claire. Claire remained beside Ranger. The retired German shepherd still rested peacefully against his handler's leg. Every few moments he glanced toward the young sailor across the room, then toward Ghost. Military dogs often noticed things humans missed. Claire quietly walked toward the petty officer. She stopped several feet away. Not because she was afraid of Ghost, but because she respected the invisible boundary the dog had created. She smiled. "May I ask you something?" The sailor nodded. "When was the last time you slept through the night?" His smile disappeared. The room became silent. He looked away. "I don't remember." Claire waited. She had learned years earlier that silence often invited honesty. The petty officer slowly rubbed his hands together. "It started after our last deployment. I thought it'd get better. It didn't. I haven't told anyone." His voice became quieter. "I figured I should be able to handle it." Ghost slowly looked up at him. The young sailor continued. "Sometimes I wake up before sunrise because I think I hear alarms. Sometimes I don't sleep at all. I've stopped calling my family because I don't want them to hear it in my voice." The room remained still. No one interrupted. Claire asked softly, "And Ghost?" The sailor smiled sadly. "He notices everything. If my breathing changes, he wakes up. If my hands shake, he presses against me. If I sit awake all night, he stays awake too." Dr. Hayes quietly closed the medical chart. Everything suddenly made sense. Ghost wasn't refusing treatment. He had simply refused to leave a partner who needed help. Claire looked toward the young sailor. "You've spent years trusting Ghost to tell you when something wasn't right." He nodded. "Today," she smiled gently, "he's trying to tell you something." The sailor's eyes filled with emotion. "You think?" Claire nodded. "I think your partner has been asking you to let someone help." For a long moment, the young sailor couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't realize. I was making him carry it too." Ghost slowly turned toward him. The petty officer knelt, placed both hands on Ghost's shoulders. His voice trembled. "I'm sorry, buddy. You don't have to watch over me by yourself anymore." Something remarkable happened. Ghost blinked. Then quietly stepped to one side, not because anyone had commanded him, because his partner had finally admitted he needed help. Dr. Hayes slowly approached the sailor. Ghost watched, but he didn't block him. The young veterinarian beside Dr. Hayes whispered, "Did he just—" The older doctor nodded. "He completed his mission." The petty officer laughed through tears. "It's the first time he's let anyone stand beside me in 2 days." Claire looked down at Ghost. "You've done your job." The Belgian Malinois slowly walked toward her. He stopped inches away. Instead of asking for attention, he gently rested his forehead against her hand. Not because she had earned his obedience, because she had understood his purpose. Nearly 30 minutes passed. For the first time all morning, the atmosphere inside the veterinary wing began to relax. Ranger accepted a routine examination while staying close to his handler. Ghost calmly drank water before lying quietly at the young sailor's feet. Several technicians smiled with relief. "I think we're finally getting ahead of today's schedule." One of the reception phones rang. Another technician answered. Her smile disappeared instantly. She looked toward Dr. Hayes. "Sir," the room grew quiet. "We have another incoming military K9. The senior veterinarian glanced at the clock. 9:47 a.m., 3 behavioral emergencies. In less than 2 hours, he slowly exhaled. "Which branch?" "Marine Corps, age 5 years, recently retired. Behavior?" The technician looked back at the report, then quietly read the final line. The words made every person in the room stop what they were doing. "Dog has shown almost no emotional response for 26 days. No barking, no excitement, no tail movement, no interaction, no interest in toys, no response to familiar commands beyond basic obedience." One young intern whispered, "Is that even possible?" Dr. Hayes answered honestly, "I've only seen it twice, and both times—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone understood how serious emotional withdrawal could become. 15 minutes later, the automatic doors opened for the 3rd time that morning. 2 Marine gunnery sergeants entered quietly. Between them walked a large black and tan German shepherd. His name tag read. Atalashi's coat was immaculate. His posture remained disciplined. His movements were controlled. To anyone unfamiliar with military dogs, he appeared perfectly healthy. Until they looked into his eyes, there was no curiosity, no fear, no excitement. Nothing. It was as though every emotion had been carefully packed away, somewhere no one could reach. One of the Marines gently spoke. Atlas. The dog stopped, but he never looked at him. The second Marine removed a faded green tennis ball from his pocket. Look what I've got. Nothing. Another handler squeaked his favorite toy. Silence. One veterinarian quietly rolled another ball across the floor. It stopped near Atlas's paws. He never even glanced at it. The young intern whispered. It's like, Dr. Hayes finished quietly. He stopped expecting anything. The Marine gunnery sergeant lowered his head. He used to love that ball. It went everywhere with him. What changed? The Marine took a slow breath. His voice became heavy. His handler retired 6 months ago. He planned to adopt Atlas. 3 days before the paperwork was completed, the Marine paused. He suffered a massive heart attack. The room fell completely silent. He didn't survive. No one spoke. The Marine continued quietly. Atlas was there. He waited beside the front door of his house for 3 straight days. He refused to leave. When we finally brought him back to base, he never acted like himself again. Several technicians lowered their eyes. Even Ghost seemed unusually still. Ranger quietly walked across the room, stopping several feet from Atlas. The old German shepherd simply looked at him, as though one retired soldier had recognized another. Dr. Hayes slowly turned toward Claire. For the first time all morning, she didn't move. She simply watched Atlas. Then she quietly said something that surprised everyone. No. The room looked at her. Dr. Hayes blinked. No? She shook her head. I'm not going to approach him. The young intern looked confused. But you helped the other two. Claire nodded. Because they were ready. She looked toward Atlas. He isn't. The room fell silent again. For the first time that morning, Claire wasn't sure what to do. And somehow, that uncertainty made every person watching believe the next few minutes might change everything. No one questioned Claire. Not because they understood what she was doing, but because everything she had done that morning had challenged what they thought they knew. The military veterinary wing fell completely silent. Atlas stood exactly where the Marines had brought him. His leash hung loosely beside him. His eyes remained fixed on the polished floor, almost empty, almost. Claire watched him for nearly a full minute. She wasn't studying the dog. She was studying the space around him. The faded tennis ball still rested beside his front paw. He hadn't looked at it once. The Marines waited anxiously. One of them quietly asked, "Is there anything we can do?" Claire looked at him. "I need you to answer one question. Anything." When Atlas lived with his handler, where did he spend most of his day? The two Marines looked at each other. Neither answered immediately. Finally, the older Marine smiled sadly. "By the front door." Claire nodded. "And after his handler passed away?" The Marine swallowed. "Still by the front door." Another pause. "He stayed there every morning, and every evening, as if," his voice cracked, "as if he believed one more mission was about to begin." Claire slowly looked back toward Atlas. "No," she whispered. "He isn't waiting for another mission." The room remained silent. "He's waiting for someone who made a promise." Nobody moved. One of the younger veterinarians frowned. "What promise?" the Marine answered before Claire could. When Sergeant Daniel Brooks retired, he knelt beside Atlas. He hugged him, and he told him. The Marine struggled to continue. "You've guarded me long enough. Next week, I'm taking you home forever." The hallway became painfully quiet. The adoption papers were already approved. The house was ready. The backyard fence had been built. He even bought Atlas his own bed. The Marine looked at the German shepherd. But he never came back. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she quietly walked past Atlas, not toward him. Past him, every person in the room watched in confusion. She continued walking until she reached the hospital's main entrance. Large glass doors overlooked the military courtyard outside. Morning sunlight streamed across the polished floor. Claire gently pushed one of the waiting chairs beside the entrance. Then she sat down, facing the doors. Not Atlas. The doctors exchanged puzzled looks. The intern whispered, "What is she doing now?" Dr. Hayes answered honestly, "I don't know." Claire rested her hands in her lap. She looked through the glass, almost as though she herself were waiting for someone. 5 minutes passed, nobody spoke. Then, she quietly said something. Not loudly, not dramatically, just softly enough for Atlas to hear. "You've waited a long time." Nothing happened. Another minute passed. Claire continued looking outside. "I know." The words weren't directed at the room. They weren't even directed at Atlas. They sounded personal. "I know what it's like to wait for someone who never comes home." The sentence seemed to stop time. Dr. Hayes slowly looked toward her. He had never heard her speak that way before. Claire continued quietly. "My husband served with Army Aviation." The room turned toward her. "He promised he'd be home for our anniversary." She smiled sadly. "He never broke a promise." A long silence followed. Life did. No one breathed. "He didn't survive the flight home." The words were gentle, matter of fact, without bitterness. "I spent months sitting beside my front window. I absolutely knew he wasn't coming, but my heart kept listening for his truck." Tears slowly filled the Marine's eyes. Claire looked toward the sunlight outside. "I wasn't waiting because I didn't understand. I was waiting because love doesn't stop just because time does." Behind her, Atlas slowly lifted his head. For the first time since entering the hospital, his eyes focused on someone. Not because she had called him, because, for the first time in months, someone understood what he had been carrying. Very slowly, Atlas took one step. Nobody moved. Another step. The young intern instinctively reached for her phone. Dr. Hayes quietly touched her arm. "No, just watch." Atlas continued walking. Not toward the blanket, not toward the toy, not toward the Marines. Toward Claire, she never turned around. She simply remained seated, looking through the glass doors, as though she truly believed someone was still coming. Atlas stopped beside her chair. He looked outside too. The two of them sat in silence, looking toward the hospital entrance. Several minutes passed. Nobody interrupted. Finally, Atlas gently lowered himself beside her, not leaning, not asking for affection, simply waiting. Claire smiled through tears. Without looking at him, she whispered, "I think he'd want you to go home now." Atlas slowly rested his head against her knee. For the first time in nearly a month, his tail moved, just once. The older Marine covered his face with both hands. "He remembers," another Marine whispered. "No, I think he finally understands." The veterinary wing seemed to breathe again. Ranger quietly walked over. The old German shepherd lay beside Atlas. Moments later, Ghost calmly joined them. 3 military dogs, 3 different stories, 3 different burdens. Resting together, the room remained completely silent. No one wanted to disturb the moment. Dr. Jonathan Hayes slowly removed his glasses. He had spent 38 years studying military working dogs. He had published research, advised military training programs, helped thousands of handlers. Yet everything he believed about behavioral medicine had been challenged in a single morning. He walked toward Claire. She gently stroked Atlas's neck. The 3 dogs never left her side. The senior veterinarian smiled, not because he had found an answer, but because he knew he hadn't. He quietly asked, "Claire." She looked up. "Yes, doctor? I've watched military dogs for nearly 4 decades. I've seen fear. I've seen loyalty. I've seen grief. But today," he looked around the room, "I watched 3 completely different dogs from 3 different branches of service place their trust in the same person." He paused. The entire veterinary wing had fallen silent once again. Doctors, handlers, technicians, military police officers, even families waiting nearby had quietly gathered outside the observation windows. Dr. Hayes smiled warmly. "So tell me, who are you?" Claire looked down at the 3 dogs. She laughed softly. "I'm just a trauma nurse." Dr. Hayes smiled. "I don't believe that." Claire remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, she looked toward the hospital courtyard. "My grandfather trained military working dogs during Vietnam." Several older veterans exchanged surprised looks. "My father continued that work. I practically grew up on military training fields. I learned commands before I learned multiplication tables." Soft laughter spread through the room. "But that's not why today happened." Dr. Hayes listened carefully. Claire continued. "When I was 12, my father introduced me to a retired military dog named Chief. He had stopped responding to everyone. My father spent weeks trying to help him. I asked why nothing worked. He smiled and said something I'll never forget." She looked at Atlas. "People spend too much time asking dogs to understand humans. Almost nobody stops long enough to understand the dog." She smiled. "I thought he meant training. It took me years to realize." He was talking about compassion. The young veterinary intern finally asked, "So, you weren't treating the dogs?" Claire gently shook her head. "No, I was treating the loneliness they couldn't explain." The room became silent again. She continued. "Ranger wasn't afraid of hospitals. He was afraid of losing the man he'd protected for 10 years. She looked toward Ghost. Ghost wasn't refusing doctors. He was carrying a burden his partner didn't know how to share. Finally, she rested her hand gently on Atlas. And Atlas, her voice became almost a whisper, was grieving, not because he forgot his handler, but because he loved him enough to keep waiting. Several handlers quietly wiped away tears. Dr. Hayes looked around the room. "I've spent my entire career teaching medicine." He smiled. Today, one emergency nurse reminded all of us that healing doesn't always begin with treatment. Sometimes it begins when someone finally feels understood. 3 months later, Walter Reed hosted its annual Military Working Dog Appreciation Day. Dozens of retired handlers returned. Families filled the hospital courtyard. Children laughed as retired military dogs demonstrated old obedience routines. Near the entrance, Dr. Hayes stood speaking with a new group of veterinary residents. He pointed toward a familiar bench beneath an old oak tree. Claire sat there quietly during her lunch break. She wasn't calling any dogs. She wasn't giving commands. She was simply reading a book across the courtyard. 3 different vehicles arrived within minutes of each other. An army truck, a Navy SUV, a Marine pickup. 3 handlers stepped out. Almost at the same time, Ranger, Ghost, Atlas. The moment they spotted Claire, all 3 dogs walked toward her, not running, not pulling on their leashes, just walking with quiet confidence. When they reached the bench, each one calmly sat beside her, exactly as soldiers might gather beside someone they trusted. The new veterinary resident stared in amazement. One quietly asked Dr. Hayes, "Why do they always find her?" The old veterinarian smiled. He watched Claire greet each dog as though they were old friends. Then he answered softly, "They don't come here because she saved them." He paused. "They come here because she never made them feel like they needed saving." Above them, the American flag moved gently in the afternoon breeze. And beneath its shadow, 3 military heroes finally rested. Not because someone had given them another mission, but because they had finally found a place where they no longer had to stand guard.